probably not a good idea to be fingering it too much, because every part of mistletoe is actually poisonous.
Ooh. Yeah. In every Christmas Regency romance, the couple always end up at least once under a piece of mistletoe and kissing, because that's what happened in Regency times, wasn't it?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Andrew. And I've been doing some research into this whole thing of kissing under the mistletoe in the Regency. Could it have happened? Well, yes, it could have happened. But actually, when I dug a little deeper, it seemed that often at this time, mistletoe was still a little bit risque. And as a result, it was usually hung up downstairs where the servants were. So in the kitchen, typically. So you have a lot of prints around this time, sort of late 18th century and up into the Regency. And the pictures always have like plates on the dresser in the background. The suggestion that this was taking place in the kitchen.
Right, because the question is, of course, how do we actually know about people using mistletoe in the Regency times? I mean, obviously we have journals and we have letters and we have prints and pictures like you were talking about. Those are our main sources of evidence, aren't they?
Well, for mistletoe, certainly, I haven't come across any references in journals to kissing under the mistletoe. Certainly, the prints of the time, I think, are a good indication of where mistletoe was used. And certainly the pictures that I've seen are nearly all of them are with plates in the background, or a definite it's the servants doing the kissing, or perhaps it's the gentleman going down below stairs to see who they could grab a kiss with. But certainly the first example that I found of perhaps someone slightly more respectable kissing under the mistletoe is in Charles Dickens' Pickwick Papers. And there's that this was, in the 1830s, and this was his first book, which was originally issued by in serial form. And in that, Mr. Pickwick, who we understand is quite respectable, was actually taken below stairs, and the owner of the house had hung the mistletoe, and it seemed like everybody was kissing everybody.
So they're all going down below stairs to have a bit of a snog under the mistletoe.
So it would appear. But as a result, I have to be left with the question, was it actually respectable for a young lady of quality to be kissing under the mistletoe?
That's a very good question, isn't it? I mean, what's the earliest time we know? I mean, people talk about the Druids using mistletoe and things like that, and the Romans. But as far as I can tell, actually, the evidence for that really is pretty scant. The Victorians like to talk about that a lot. But, I mean, they were almost as close to the Druids as we are, which is an awful long way away, to be honest. And people didn't write much down in those days, and there aren't any pictures either. So what's the earliest time we actually know about mistletoe being used? Because I think it popped up in some songs and things like that, didn't it? Yeah,
well, there's certainly the habit of decorating houses with greenery goes back to almost like the introduction of Christmas, because with the introduction of Christianity into Great Britain, there was generally taking over of the old pagan festivals, which is why the pagans used to celebrate the winter solstice, which was 21st of December, which is today. And they would be celebrating the solstice. The Christians wanted to switch that to a bit later and be celebrating Christmas. But they took on some of the customs, one of which was bringing greenery inside. So they would use evergreens as a sign of life to bring into their houses. And as far as we know, this did include mistletoe. The earliest reference that I've come across so far to Christmas and mistletoe connection is in a poem by Herrick, written in the 17th century, in which he talks about taking down the greenery at Christmas. And in this, he includes a reference to mistletoe, which suggests that mistletoe was used along with other green or evergreens to decorate houses.
So
at
holly,
Christmas.
holly and stuff like that.
So holly and ivy and laurel and, so along with those different evergreens was in the house.
I mean, I have a piece of mistletoe in here. In fact, actually, it's not a real mistletoe. It's a Christmas decoration. It's fake mistletoe. But this is what mistletoe looks like. I'm sure you've seen it. It's got the green leaves and it's got the white berries. Interesting, there is a red berry version of mistletoe that tends to grow in Spain, apparently, from my in-depth research. But read anything about mistletoe and it will almost always say it has white berries. So this is mistletoe.
Well, of course, if this was real mistletoe, probably not a good idea to be fingering it too much because every part of mistletoe is actually poisonous.
Ooh. Yeah.
Mistletoe is used in still used in medicine today.
So when's the first time there's any reference to kissing under mistletoe? That's what we really want to know. Did Jane Austen write about it, for example?
Not that I know of. The first reference that is generally believed to have happened is in 1784, and it was in a comic opera called 2 to 1, which was written in that year. And there's reference in one of the verses there to maids kissing under the mistletoe. Now, that's the earliest reference I've found and is generally acknowledged to be the earliest reference. But I've come across a book that quotes a poem that sounds as though it could be earlier, that mentions mistletoe, but it's undated. So I think possibly the tradition went back earlier, but that's the generally recognised, the end of the 18th century is when it became something of a thing.
So that was 1760s, you're saying?
80s.
1780s?
Yeah.
Okay, but as you said, typically when something gets written down, it's probably been happening before then in order for it to sort of get into popular culture and end up being written down. So at some point during the 18th century, the 1700s, kissing under mistletoe perhaps became a thing.
I think that's a reasonable assumption. It could have gone back earlier. What you have to remember is during England had quite a checkered career in the 17th century. We had the Civil War and a lot of the customs that came over from the Tudor period just sort of disappeared because
they cancelled Christmas.
Yeah, they cancelled Christmas.
They cancelled Christmas. Cromwell cancelled Christmas for years.
So I think then people were after the end of the 17th century, people were reinventing Christmas, if you like,
right,
and establishing new traditions along with the old ones, looking into old traditions and finding out whether these were good things to have. And certainly the tradition of decorating houses with greenery and things, that was an age-old tradition.
So it's safe to say that in the latter half of the 18th century, so sort of 1750 onwards, you may have had people kissing under mistletoe, but typically they would have been servants. So it would have happened in the servants' halls, in the kitchens and places like that. And then in the early 19th century, at some point, it was picked up on by the sort of householders and they thought, this is actually quite a nice thing to do. Let's have a bit of kissing under the mistletoe.
Yeah, I don't know how much of it's to do with a change in the class structure. Certainly, I think that probably this was a taboo thing for the upper classes. I haven't come across references to it with regard to like the nobility, the aristocracy, possibly with farmers' wives and things. There's a picture I've seen of mistletoe hanging in a farmer's kitchen, so more like a not a wealthy person's kitchen, but where they might have eaten in the kitchen. So that you then gradually see it becoming more acceptable. I do wonder whether Dickens in his Pickwick Papers and also in A Christmas Carol, whether the idea of hanging mistletoe and kissing under it became more acceptable and it became popularised in the same way that Prince Albert and Queen Victoria popularised Christmas trees.
Right. Christmas trees. I mean, that's a whole separate subject, isn't it? I mean, I know there's an early reference to a tree being decorated in the streets of London in about the 1400s, about 1440. There's a reference to a decorated tree. Whether that's a Christmas tree, who knows? But it certainly was decorated for the Christmas period. But certainly the Christmas tree as we know it, like this one behind us, is very much a Victorian invention, as you said. Is it not?
No.
Okay. But you just said Prince Albert and Queen Victoria popularised it.
Ah, that's the key word. Popularised. Popularised and invented do not go together. So Queen Charlotte is generally credited with introducing Christmas trees into Britain.
Queen Charlotte was
Queen Charlotte was George III's wife,
right,
and she was a German.
Right.
And it was a German tradition to decorate trees and put candles on them and hang sweets on them and put toys under them for the children.
Right.
I think in Germany, perhaps it was more widespread and it was for presents for the whole family. But certainly when it was introduced originally in England, the trees had presents under them which were more specifically for the children.
Okay. So your Regency Christmas then, it's looking like it's got maybe a tree, but probably not, because most people didn't. That was very much Queen Charlotte and the royal household maybe had a tree, but it wasn't popularised. And then you may have had mistletoe, but probably hanging in the servants' quarters.
Interesting though. These things tended to get copied. So I think you only need 1 or 2 people to do something that looks fun and people copy it. When I first wrote a blog about Christmas trees, someone contacted me and said, actually, I know my ancestor, the Duke of Portland, actually had a Christmas tree in 1807 because he'd copied it from his connection with the royal court. And so I think that as soon as one person started doing something like this, the idea spread.
Of course, there is that famous image of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert with the Christmas tree, but it was on a table, wasn't it? It's actually quite a small tree. It wasn't like a big 6-7 footer like we've got here. It was a tabletop tree.
I think the one you're referring to is in the Illustrated London News in the 1840s. And yes, that is the sort of classic print that we kind of look to as introducing Christmas trees to the world, to England at large. Interestingly, I've read some different descriptions of trees, and certainly there was one of the ones that Queen Charlotte had seemed to be in a tub on the floor. So certainly that sounded like quite a big tree. But later when Princess Victoria's describing her childhood experience, that was talking about trees in tubs on tables again. Right. So obviously the size of the tree wasn't so important then. It was more a case of having a tree inside, decorating it with candles and with what Americans will call candies, we would call sweetmeats or sweets. That's kind of thing. And basically the children would then have a share of the sweets and a present from under the tree.
So there we are, your Regency Christmas in the early years of the 19th century. You probably didn't have a Christmas tree unless you were connected with the royal family in some way and you'd seen that they had one, like the Duke of Portland obviously did, and you were inspired by that. But you would have had lots of greenery decorating your house. You probably wouldn't have put it up, I believe, until Christmas Eve itself. Rather, you wouldn't have had the whole weeks before.
Well, that's probably, I haven't actually found anything that definitely says that they put their greenery up at Christmas Eve. But as Christmas Eve was, Christmas Day was really the beginning of the festivities. It was the idea that that you would prepare the house for Christmas Day. Right. So I think putting the decorations up, the greenery on Christmas Eve really, would be a good assumption. But quite when they took it down is an interesting one, because traditionally we think about it happening on 12th night, on the 5th of January. But actually, I've come across references such as Herrick's poem dating back to the 17th century, which talk about taking down the greenery on Candlemas Day, which is actually the 2nd of February.
That's like 40 days later.
Yeah, that's right. 40 days after Christmas. That was the idea.
Yeah, and I have heard that certainly amongst the lower classes, they were quite keen to extend Christmas for 40 days because it meant more parties, basically.
But of course, a lot of the people, the lower classes, were working on the land. This was a very slow time for them. There wasn't actually much work to do. It was the ideal time for them to have a big party season. So from that point of view, I think that having an extended period of rest fitted in well with the working calendar.
Yeah, so in an agricultural society, this time of year, late December, early January, or through January, is pretty dead. Not much really happens out there. Excellent. Okay, so yeah, your Regency Christmas, you may have a tree, probably not. You'd have greenery. You might have some mistletoe, but hanging up in the servants' quarters more than likely. But you'd certainly be having a party, maybe starting Christmas, maybe going on for 12 days, maybe 40 days. and having a bit of Regency fun, really.
Yes, and I would like to see a few more Regency romances set at Christmas time, where the couples actually make their way down to the kitchen for a kiss under the mistletoe. I think that's much more likely to have happened, and I shall be sure to include that when I write a Christmas Regency. So we're recording this video on the 21st of December 2022, and we wish you a very happy Christmas and a new year full of peace, joy and hope.